Hello, welcome to Scrap Time. My name's Christine, and this video is part of the Inky background series, and we are going to be embossing. But we're going to be embossing a few different ways. So I'm starting with the basic way. The way most of you probably know is when you stamp and you put your embossing powder on and then heat it. So this one here, I use the Stitches stamp. This is the stamp set. It's from Tim Holtz. And I used the long one. There's all different lengths depending which way you want it to go. And then I just used a gold embossing powder with it. This one is from Ranger. So then here, I wanted to get a little bit more grungy. And I used this stamp from the Mixed Media set. This is an older set. I'm not sure if it's still available. You can look. But I decided to use this set stamp here that was sort of grungy. And I used it with the Aged Ochre embossing enamel from Stampendous. And these enamels are really cool because they have different flecks in them. I don't know if you can sort of see it. I can open it up. But there's all different, it's not just a solid like the gold was, there's different things happening in them. And there's so many cool combinations. Again, I bought this a while ago, hopefully they still make it. I know there's other embossing powders out there now though that are similar, that they'll mix in different things and you have different specs in them. Now I just want to point out that when I stamped, it didn't stamp here, but because of the background being the way it is, I don't mind. It's not like I was looking for that perfect stamped image in this case. So I just let it go, and by the time I do whatever else I'm going to do, I won't notice anymore. So here I use that same script stamp that I've been using when we did the stamping. I had even stamped it over on this side. And I decided to just use a tonal one. So I'm not sure what color this actually is, but I'll link it in. Oh, it is Crushed Mulberry. But because I had these purples in here, I thought just sort of a tonal little embossing on the side, and it gives it that raised texture and a bit of the sort of gloss finish to it. And this is a Nuvo embossing powder. And then over here, you can see that little image there. First off, I used the Fragments stamp set from Tim Holtz. So if you notice, this is the stamp I used right here. And you can see all that detail. There's lines in that. So I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out because I already have some multi-medium under here and I have texture going on. So I stamped all these using the VersaMark ink. And I was impressed that I was still able to get the lines and like the stripes in the background and the florals in there, that it didn't just turn out to be a blob, even though I was embossing over top of texture that's already on the card. And for that, I used the Cool Jade embossing powder from Nuvo. So I'm going to show you the basic embossing first. So as I mentioned before, I'm using VersaMark ink, but you can use any embossing inks. There's many on the market. And I'm going to stamp some texture on this side of my card. So that means I need to ink up this side of my stamp. Now I've had this ink pad for a long time and I haven't used it for a long time, and when I went to use it, it was still perfectly nice and moist, and I didn't need to add anything to it. Now I think I did this the last time too. I inked up the wrong side of the stamp, so I'm just going to ink the whole stamp. And just so you can see it better, I'm going to use the gold embossing powder with it. So I'm going to stamp this the same way I did the other stamping. Oh, I see why, because it's upside down. I did originally stamp it correctly, or ink it. So I'm going to lay it down there because I sort of want it all to have that. But then I'm going to just roll it a bit. I'm going to bring in a piece of paper so my embossing powder has some place to fall. And I use a little measuring spoon. Just sometimes I do it, sometimes I pour it directly on. So it ended up to be sort of like that. It looks sort of fun. And then all you do is get it like that and back in. You will have a container of embossing powder for a very long time, unless you're doing something where you're embossing piles and piles of things at once. You will have this embossing powder for a very long time. Use very little. So I did all my samples using the Ranger heat tool, but because it does take longer because it diffuses the heat, for this I'm now bringing in my embossing heat tool. This is a Marvy one. I've had this again for years. I think they're now black or something, I'm not sure. But any embossing tool will work. So if you've never embossed before, that is the magic of embossing. You put your ink on, then your powders. The powders are basically a really fine plastic material. And then you heat it up, it melts, and you have this really cool texture on your projects. But you can do a lot more than just using your stamps. So now I just want to show you on this one, I used a stencil, and I have the embossing ink dabber. I put some on my sheet and I just painted it through my stencil. And this time I used the Nuvo glitter embossing gold enchantment powder. You can see the sparkle in there. And then I added it and just heated it onto my project. And because it was glitter, it now has those little specks. It's not completely smooth like the gold would be. So you can use it with stencils and just painting in your embossing powder. I'm not going to demo that one. I think you get the idea because we have more to do. So now I used this stencil and I just taped off the area to use this part of it here. And what I did is I used the texture paste, opaque texture paste with the Ocean Sparkle Nuvo embossing powder. So when I did this, I put the texture paste through the stencil, then I added my powders, and then I heat it right away. I didn't wait for the paste to dry or anything. I just heated it right away, and now I have this cool little sparkle raised design on my project. So what I have done is a bit earlier, I put my embossing paste through the stencil. I used this stencil again. And this time I used gold embossing powders on it. And so now I'm going to heat it. So you can do this and you can heat it right away, or you can set it aside and come back and heat it later. So I'm just going to heat it up. So you might have noticed while I was heating it, it was bubbling up a bit, and that's the texture paste underneath it sort of bubbling it up. Typically it will, after it cools, it will go down, but if it does leave those bubbles, I think when we're doing this mixed media sort of idea, it just makes it more interesting. So I'm just going to show you the difference. It's two different embossing powders, but here it's flat, and then here we have that cool raised. So that's the difference when you use a texture paste underneath the image. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now I was thinking I have clear embossing powders, or clear translucent texture paste, and I have one of the new Distress Glaze powders, Vintage Photo. And these are also clear. So I thought, what would happen if I combine the two? So again, I put on my texture paste just through a stencil. And then I put on my powders, and I didn't wait for it to dry. I just heated it right away. And you have sort of this glaze. I thought it might be a little more translucent than it was, but you can still see some of the under part coming through. If you compare it to this, where it's completely solid, here it's more shiny and has sort of that glazed look. So I'm going to, so I have here, I already put through my texture paste, and I put the glaze, embossing glaze on top. So now we're going to heat this one up. Just want it to cool a bit before you touch it, but you can see the difference between the two here. When you have, it still gives you raised areas, but it's more glazy and translucent versus the solid. So that's another cool combination. You can use the translucent texture paste with the distressed glazes, and you can get an interesting look. Okay, and now on to our final way is I want to use the glaze a bit more, and so I decided to paint with it and just adding it in little areas to add to your project. So what I did, I have a background here. So again, I have my Emboss It dabbers, and I opened it up, and I just, inside you see there's the stuff. So I just pick up a bit with my brush and just decided, where do I want a bit of that glaze to come. Now with this, I decided I'm going to work bit by bit, because I wasn't exactly sure. You know, if you work your way around, you'll be like, where did I put the glaze or the embossing stuff, inks? So I'm going to do the bottom first. And also, if you don't like where it ended up, like there, just pick it off before you heat it. I don't necessarily want it all in there. I've got to move this aside. I don't want to heat it up. So then so now you can see just in certain areas that glaze is coming up. So then I can like go, oh, where else do I want a bit of glaze? And maybe I just want a little bit on the side there. So I can and then so by using a brush, you get to sort of paint with your embossing powders. Decide where you want to put them. And if you just work over top of a sheet like this, and then you can clean up after. So I'm going to put them sort of on first, and then I'm going to heat it. Once your powders are on your ink, you have some time to work with them. You don't have to heat it right away. Now some of it has gone sort of over there, but I actually like that. It's sort of the little bit, so I'm going to leave that. So let's heat this. So you can see it's not a lot that I've added on this one, but just that little bit. But I want to show you one more thing. So I'm going to clean up this. So I just want to bring in a bit more color. You can see down here when I had done the distress crayon, I have a bit of blue. So I want to put in a little bit of blue embossing powder. So I'm going to go back in with a brush. And again, I don't need a lot of ink for this. So I'm going to paint a bit down here. I'm going to put it, and maybe a bit over here. And I can go over top of where I already have a bit of stuff going on. I'm going to just, because I didn't use a lot of the glaze. Oh, I just sort of covered it up, didn't I? Okay. So I'm going to have to heat this. And what I'm going to do, hopefully, we'll see. Hold on. So while it's wet, I'm going to just put a couple little I really don't want a lot, because when it will expand. I just want those few little specks. So that's why I'm just doing it off my finger. So you can see how I added in just a little bit of blue into that glaze as well. When I did this one originally, I added a lot more in, and that's why this time I didn't want as much there. I see it was like quite thick, and so I just wanted some little specks. So you can paint and add your glaze and a little speck of other colors too, and mix it up. So we can go back, look at everything we've done. Let me just close my lids. You don't want spilled embossing powders, because that would make a big mess. So if we go back to the different techniques, so the last thing we did is we painted. This is the translucent embossing powder with the glazes. Here we have the texture paste with the embossing powders. This one we painted it in through a stencil. Here we have that same, it's the texture paste but with a glitter embossing. And then we stamped and embossed. So you have a few different ways you can use these powders. These are only some of them. I mean, there's so many techniques with embossing powders, but it's just a great way to add yet something else to your backgrounds. Thanks for watching. Be sure to give our video a thumbs up and subscribe to Scrap Time videos on YouTube. And for more Inky backgrounds, be sure to check out the Inky background playlist.